president's popularity is steadily eroding, and then every couple of months there's some new event that knocks it down a peg, obviously leading up to August 9th. But there's also some things that you can do to bolster the president's popularity, to shore up his base. How do these events work? How are they planned? How are they implemented?
Yeah, well, let us not forget, he's still the leader of the free world. He has a responsibility of hundreds of millions of people here in the United States. And so part of the events and things you're going to do are to buck him up, give him the inner strength to continue to do his job to the best of his ability. So you would find groups that he had an affinity for, or who had an affinity for him, or somebody who wanted to come out and show some special support, things like that. And that oftentimes was, there was a group, one of the best domestic events I ever did, and I will never forget, was the dedication of the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville, Tennessee. At the time, country music didn't quite have the allure and the sort of mainstream embrace that it has today. And they were seen as almost a regional play, if you will, underappreciated, seen as sort of not ready for prime time kind of thing. And Richard Nixon always had an affinity for him, was able to relate to them because I think in part for the sort of hardscrabble youth that he'd gone through and everything like that. And so it was the perfect coming together of that country music group. This was they had arrived because now the Grand Ole Opry was going to have its own home, state of the art for that time. It was just, it was bigger than big. And of course, having the president to come down and acknowledge that for the whole world to see was also big. So I was the lead advance person on that, and
did you know that he
was one of those magic? We were there for the, going through this intense event, but they had us come over, and I was a country music fan myself, which I learned in Vietnam how to love country music. They took us over for the last night in the Ryman Auditorium, which was the old and had been the home of the whole heart, I would say, of country music was done there. And that last night, everybody who was anybody in that business got a chance to come on the stage and play and do their thing. And then they sat around backstage, telling stories, doing little riffs with one another. It was magic. And we got to bed, I think it was 3 o'clock in the morning. We had to get up at 5 or whatever, some crazy hour for the event day. And they were just so ecstatic, and the crowd showed up early, and we did much earlier than we ever anticipated, and that was taking care of that, so finally everybody gets in there, and that hall was just it was on fire. The crowd was so excited. All these great people the night before who were the legends of the business had been at the Ryman are now backstage. We're roaming in each other's dressing rooms as they do, sitting in the hallways, plucking away, and it's just going like this. And we're calling back reports. This is a real happening, we're really going to get there. And so we had a couple little tricks up there, Steve, that that nobody was going to know about, and that was the president does his little thing there, and he sits down and plays the piano, and the place went absolutely nuts. And then he does the yo-yo thing. Just brings tears to my eyes, because people stood up on the chairs, even though the ones that folded up, they just went out of their mind, and it was just one of those kind of things that you'll never forget. And and he went out of there just supercharged, and he was, and those were the things that we tried to do and tried to help. And this one didn't need much of our help, because it was one of those perfect kind of events where you married together people who wanted to help, maybe didn't quite know how, but here was an event that came together that allowed them to help one another draw strength from each other. It was just fabulous.
How did how did President Nixon decide, or maybe it was Dave Parker, but how did they decide to accept the invitation to go down to the Grand Ole Opry?
I don't know that the background of all that. All I remember being told was, we got one. I want it. So I got to be the lead, and it just was terrific. There was very good relationships. It was built on the NASCAR backing, the affinity for country music. There was just a lot of ties. I mean, the South was going through this. Culturally, it wasn't going through a huge change, except what we were seeing was the sort of evolution of locals embracing the Republican approach to things. And then we had, of course, the race situation was still, a part of an issue out there, and all. So there was a lot of people, when you would go through the South, they were looking for something new or looking for something different, and when they would find it in an event or an experience, you could see it. And this was one of those where, those groups just found whatever they were looking for, and it just happened in a magic way, and was captured on film, and I got to be there, and consider myself extraordinarily fortunate. That's just something I'll never forget.
Did anyone suggest to President Nixon that he wear a hat with the price tag on it?
I don't know if anybody did, but
it would have been.
Yes, I think that was pretty clear.
I'm just thinking because it's the Grand Ole Opry.
Yes. Oh yeah, Minnie Pearl. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. No. She was there, but he didn't get the hat. Thank God. And they were all told that because, of course, they're all walking around with big hats on and everything. They had no hats for the president. And so that was the one thing we were on pins and needles about, was that, some people, oh yeah, of course, and then they'll go do what they want to do. And of course, everybody had hats. And so we were just sitting there that was going to happen. And luckily it didn't. So.
What else? I mean, you've got Rabbi Korf is around at this point, and there's some rallies, or at least one rally that I can think of, where President Nixon actually gets a chance to meet his supporters. And this must have been both to, cheer them up, and also, as you say, to
help him feel recharged. And those were, as I said, there were just different groups and people who really stepped up and recognized this opportunity to bring these elements together, help the president get buckered up at a time when things were clearly tough. You could see that, and to help people who had believed and all to actually interact with a person who sort of set that path that helped them find their way, so to speak, through a series of policies or approaches or leadership, whatever the case may be. And Rabbi Korf was so incredibly generous with his willingness to work. And we would only work once events had been established and there was something that's going to happen, and all. And so I think it was the Public Liaison Office that did a lot of the background on that, if I'm not mistaken. But they would give us a contact.
That would be
would be the natural place where those affinity groups would match up, where the scheduled proposal would go forward to the scheduling office, and they would decide.
Through the summer, there's obviously quite a bit going on, summer of '74. When do you find out that the president is going to the Middle East?
We didn't have a whole lot of time, like none. That's the other event I will never forget. First of all, Anwar Sadat was the president of Egypt at that time, and has a very dramatic figure. And that was the period of time where, in their mind's eye as an Egyptian, they had won victory on the battlefield, which hadn't happened for a long, long period of time, gave them I think a spirit, a jolt of nationalism, and Sadat was one of the most incredible people I'd ever had the opportunity to be around and work. Just a persona, one of those people who you could be standing in a room and he would maybe come in quietly through another door, but the minute he was in the room, you would know it. You could feel it. He was that dramatic. And so we had very short notice. Technology wasn't then what it is today. They dropped us in there and I was the lead advance for all of Egypt, which was going to be Alexandria, the port city, and then also Cairo, of course, the capital. And so I had a team of folks, and we were pretty thin by then, and had virtually no time. We didn't have an ambassador. It was just a very small office that had only been there for a small period of time. They had very few resources. And they dropped us in and said, we'll be back in 6 days. And okay. Because of the technology, I didn't have contact with the White House for all 6 of the days when we planned that extraordinary event of not only massive millions and millions of crowds and the train ride down to Alexandria, all these things. And I know Bill Hinkle later confided in me how they were absolutely going nuts, but there was you couldn't communicate. So you didn't have any choice but to operate on your own. And of course they had other things they were doing too. And the other thing that was interesting about that, having traveled a lot through my not only advanced activities but in Vietnam, one of my key things is I never eat anything local until I'm very confident. Several days have passed and nobody else got sick. Well, everybody on my team got sick, and all I ever drank was I drank their tea because it was hot. I did that for 6 days, and I lasted because I could stand up and operate, and so then eventually people would get well and they'd come back into it. But it was a harried. I had some great folks, on the advanced team. Frank Ursamorso had the site out at the pyramids where the president had a house. Mike McManus had all the motorcades, and they were huge because they were like 80, 100 cars, and we didn't. I mean, these are two groups of societies that hadn't interacted for decades, had been bitter enemies, in fact. And so going through all of that was, and then we had that whole train ride back and forth, which was absolutely incredible, taking a high-speed train down there and having the Egyptians, who are great horsemen, ride alongside at full speed. I mean, just some extraordinary things. And then get all the way to Alexandria. And I think there were 3 or 4 external events where he's coming in or going out of the city or doing whatever. And there were, millions and millions and millions of people. And then, I think that famous approbation, the equivalent of our clap, if you will. And you just hear this eerie sound of these people going absolutely crazy. And again, it's one of those moments. Here was a U.S. president at that time, clearly the power of the world, somebody to whom they didn't know about now in front of them, and they couldn't have been warmer. They couldn't have been more friendly, and the events couldn't have been more extraordinary. But what happens is Air Force One is getting ready to land, and this is with the president on the plane. Finally, I'm able to hook up with Hinkle, and all he can say, "What the hell's going on?" And I says, "Well, it's been quite a trip. We don't have long enough to do it. Just trust me." and we did the event, and it was to this day the most extraordinary event that I've done. It just, because it was, again, this coming together of all these things. And they had other great stops on that trip, that ours was the first. Mm-hmm. So that's what made it the most difficult. And that's why the communications was a problem. And of course, if we didn't get started on the right foot, who knows what would have happened. But it turned out to be a very successful trip all the way around. And I would just, I told Bill Hinkle this, that I'd never be able to thank him enough for giving me the opportunity to do that, and the folks that were on the team from the advance office and the others as well. Just everybody worked. Just there, Frank Ursamorso was out at the pyramids, and it gets so hot out there, and he couldn't get enough liquids that his tongue would swell up, and he couldn't even hardly talk, because of that. And so these were all just conditions none of us had really experienced before, but it was phenomenal experience. And the president just, wow. You could just see his eyes light up. You could see his swagger. You could see he and Sadat, and they just, the two great leaders with just unbelievable international personas, coming together and doing what they could do.
Well, I mean, the details of this, I mean, the contingencies. I know for the China trip, there were months of negotiations, and General Scowcroft went over beforehand, and they sent General Haig over beforehand, and there were pre-advanced trips after pre-advanced trips, and they installed the communications, and they made sure to have everything, and then you're asked to do something of a similar nature in less than a week.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you, one of the things that was interesting, just to get a scope of this, we're going to go and fly on a helicopter, an Egyptian helicopter, from Cairo down to Alexandria. And we're flying, guess what we're flying over? We're flying over the Sinai and all the gun emplacements and everything. So you still see, they're all locking onto you. You can watch and see these guns, and the turrets. I mean, it was just, and we're just praying that nobody shot us. I mean, it could have ended by somebody getting trigger happy or not recognizing what it was or what. So I just, and luck. It was, the way I looked at it, I'm a little bit of a fatalist. It was meant to be. For whatever became of the Middle East and where we're going to go, that was a special moment that for some divine being just sense that this had to be a success, and willed us to have the energy and the luck to have it come off that way.
Now, did the who came up? Just thinking about the headline photo caption. I mean, the two presidents with the pyramids in the background. I mean,
we set that up.
Some of the how do you obviously you want something with the pyramids, but it's not like the pyramids are remote from the city. I mean, they're basically right there, aren't they?
No, they're out.
Yeah,
they're out a good ways.
Oh, well,
you got to go out there. Yeah.
So
they flew by helicopter to get out there, as a matter of fact.
And famously, of course,
it left the helicopter. And none of us knew that. And I forget that. He says, "Well, Mr. President, my gift to you is the helicopter. Oh, and I will also leave the instruction manual and my pilot." We left. That sort of was the essence of this magic trip, and I think the biggest thing that Nixon could do to show his gratitude for the coming together that had just taken place over the last 3 days.
Well, General Scowcroft told us that he spent the better part of a year working out the gift with the bureaucracy.
I'm sure he did. And I bet that, and I am sure that never crossed Nixon's mind when he thought about what he was going to do, which is probably why he didn't tell anybody.
I don't want to get in trouble for saying this, but I do have to say that giving a head of government a helicopter is probably better than giving them DVDs.
I think so. I think that works better, yes. Yeah, well, of course, going through
certainly more grandiose.
What was on that helicopter, Thinking of,
and here's the code manual.
Exactly.
Who advanced Beirut? This has nothing to do with you, as far as I know. Who advanced Beirut?
Who advanced Beirut? I don't remember. I remember.
Which has to be an
Gartland
even tougher.
Did Riyadh. Dewey Clower did Damascus. Can't remember who did Beirut, or there was one other stop. Yeah, Jerusalem.
Jerusalem, yeah.
I just draw a blank. I mean,
just thinking of all these advances.
First drop, and I never got out, and you just worried about your event, and then we didn't get picked up to continue because there was so much interest on the trip. So what we did is the other thing that was so interesting about that trip is the president was going to go back and then turn right around and head over to Russia.
Right.
So those of us that knew we were going to Russia, as I called it, we were dead. So I said, "I'm not sure where we're going, but I'm taking the team to Copenhagen because we can fly from Copenhagen to Russia, and all we want to do is go to Tivoli, drink beer, eat ice cream, and be in some cooler weather." And so we just left. We did. We just, after it was all done, said our goodbyes and left. And sure enough, then we went in our respective places to Russia right immediately thereafter.
Well, the Soviet trip had to feel routine after Egypt.
It was. We had been to Russia before, so there was that one-time experience and some relationships. Yeah, there was nothing like going into to the first time into Egypt like that.
This brings up just a question that I've been thinking of. when someone like Brezhnev visits the United States, as in '73, are you consulted at all? I mean, do the advancemen play any role in that sort of a, if the two heads of state are going somewhere?
Oh, if they're going to go somewhere.
If they're going to go somewhere, yeah.
Yeah, if they're going to go somewhere other than, we as advanced people during the Nixon administration, if it was something to do with the State Department and those, they would take care of it, and we would have a minimal role. If they were to go outside of the sort of Washington federal complex, Washington, D.C., White House area, we'd do an advance just like you'd normally do an advance. And, of course, it would be supplemented with people from the State Department,
So President Nixon resigns. He gives a speech August 8th. August 9th, he departs. Where are you?
I'm coming back from California. I went out and did what ended up being Richard Nixon's last event, which was in Phoenix, Arizona. And it was a big rally at their arena that they had there, and then went out west. And I'm being from California, decided, okay, well, we'll go and take a couple days, and so then I'm coming back, and then the fatal thing occurred during that period of time. So, again, asking the questions, well, what next?
Yeah.
We've been there before, a few years earlier. But that's sort of the life of advance and campaign kind of people is you don't necessarily know from one year to the next what's going to happen and where you're going to be. So by then, I was pretty confident that I'd get a job somewhere, and we'll see what would happen. And then it was Dick Cheney who called me in, and had said, well, Red, we're going to be staffing the new administration. President Ford, looking around at people, and is there anything in your background you'd like to tell me about that maybe I don't know? And I said, well, there may be, but they don't have any relevancy to do with this. And we don't have any black sheep in my closet or anything to speak of. So I said, and that's when he offered me the job to head up the office and all. And it was, probably clearly the highest honor that I think I'd probably say I ever had, or close to it. I mean, it was really very, very special to get a chance to, at a time when the country was clearly in need of a real pick-me-up kind of a thing, to be asked to do that. I think people had such high expectations of what Richard Nixon was going to do at the time of the '72 election, and then never being able to really fully actualize that. There was obviously a letdown, concern. Well, where are we going to go? How can we do? We still haven't got some of the big problems solved. And then there was this chance for Jerry Ford, who I don't think had an enemy in the world. At least that was the impression. And to get a chance to try and, as I mentioned earlier, use some of the skills that we brought from that advanced culture to help him try and be the person he wanted to be was both a high honor and a bit daunting at the time. Could you do it or not? And from that time on, I got to be a part of the president was just a terrific person, treated us almost like family, because we had been with him as vice president so much, and now that other period of time. And I think when they write the history books, no doubt they're going to say great things about what President Nixon accomplished during his time. But I think one of the great things they're going to write is that Jerry Ford was underestimated to go from where the country was at the time when Richard Nixon had to resign to essentially what you'd call a fairly normal election in '76, 2+ years away. It was a tribute to the fact that Jerry Ford had the right sense of where the pulse of the citizenry was, and led a life and provided leadership that got people to make that transition from the sadness and the despair and the what next to okay, let's do it. And had it not been for a few last-minute quirk here or there, he would have been able to have continued on the Nixon legacy, missing by only, I think it was 17,000 votes in Ohio.
Something really small. It's almost a coin flip.
Yeah,
at that
exactly, exactly the way things went. So that's sort of my experience in that, and yeah, it's just one of those things that you're forever grateful for. It shaped my whole life. The time that I spent learning how to be an advanced person, being an advanced person and executing, and then getting to be the leader of advanced teams and helping those people go through the same thing that I'd gone through, and go through a couple of presidential elections, and having played some role that was a positive contribution.
I want to ask a little bit about your work during the Ford administration. I understand there was a problem with a balloon drop.
Ah, yes, the famous balloon drop. The lesson, that was unavoidable, unfortunate. Yeah, we were in a hall where you did the classic, had all the balloons up there, and the tons of people and all. And we were, through some mechanical and weather problems, we were very late getting there. But the hall was absolutely packed, and it was getting hotter and hotter, and making the site advance. When are you guys going to get here? This place is hotter than you know what, and the people are getting anxious. They're going to break down the walls. Get there, get there. Well, what was happening is the static electricity was also building up in there. So all the balloons that were in the ceiling, that under any kind of normal conditions would, when you pulled the string, they'd float down and do what they're supposed to do. Well, this time, as the president's coming off after he gives a speech and is going to go off one side of the dais and work the crowd line across there and everything like that, then the balloons are going to come down. Well, it's become referred to as the balloon plop, because the static electricity kept most of them together, and they just came down in huge big chunks. And of course, he's wading through all this stuff, these balloons, 6 feet, 7 feet high. And I didn't hear the exact comment that he told to Dick Cheney, but it was very clear when I got on the plane that we would have no more balloon drops like that ever. And I've heard Dick tell the story about that, the actual direct conversation he and Ford had about that too. So yeah, one of those things. So you live in the heights and you live with the lows, and that was one of the big lows. You're always fighting for perfection, and even something that becomes sort of an anecdote, and the people in the crowd, they loved it. They thought to them it was still very funny. They had a great time. But yeah, I wish it didn't happen. But I never again went into a hall or something like that I didn't make sure was really chilled down, that we were on time, or if not, we just left the balloons up there.
It reminds me, there's a story about how on the 68 trail, candidate Nixon got so upset at something that had gone wrong at an airport stop that when the plane took off, he turned to Bob Haldeman and said, "We're never stopping at an airport again."
Yep, I can see. Yeah, in the moment of, you can only take that back.
How does the advanced team change under President Ford? In terms of its personality, it's how you operate.
It does. It becomes a very different now. The interesting thing, the Nixon structure was very structured, and it had its, much like a corporate ladder where things went up the chain, you got an answer, and they came back down the thing and all that. In the Ford White House, it was sort of the exact opposite. The president would sign off on a general trip, just, oh yeah, we're going to go there, and turn it over to us in the advance operation. That was it. And I have to get basically approval for anything. Obviously we could interact with all the political people that wanted to have the mayor meet here, the governor meet here, so all those kind of things, but not having to send decisional memos about who's going to be at the greeting at the foot of the you just sort of used it. So what had built up with then Vice President Ford over that period of time when he served as Vice President was a level of understanding and a level of trust about the capacity to which we could execute that I think he and Don Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney and all sort of trusted us, and rarely did we have to get into too much details. As a matter of fact, another great sort of metaphor for that mindset was we were doing our trip abroad, first trip to Japan, first time an American president had ever stepped foot on Japanese soil. And they had a chief of protocol who the president said he wanted me to do the trip and we'll plan it, and did all that. So we did most all the stuff. But the chief of protocol said, well, I have the white tie and the morning coat, the appropriate, really the formal attire that's going to be met.
When you meet the emperor.
Yeah, and we said, well, no, we'll take care of it. No, I've got, and I finally went to Dick, and I think he even talked to the president about this. He says, no, the ambassador's he's going to take care of this. And this was the chief of protocol. And so Ford's getting in dressed, puts these things on, and they come up to his calf. Oh, God, and there is no time. There is no time. So, President, I mean, we did everything we could, to sort of try to put bands and ties that was underneath his foot, between his sock and the heel, and drag it. And it was still, and he was fuming. I mean, this was the big moment, So then, there was another one of those famous trips on the way back. That was the end of the protocols activities dealing with anything that had to do with abroad. So we became the people, and I became the negotiator. Now, we had people from state on the substantive side and everything, but it's just these funny little things that happen that become moments that create impressions or give a sense, and this was one of those kind of things. Jerry Ford was that was one of the rare times I ever really saw him get upset, was that, because he was such an absolutely unassuming person. And one of the other metaphors occurred when we went to Kyoto. We were in a hotel going up in the elevator, and so there was a little Japanese gal in her beautiful outfit with the white gloves on. She's the elevator operator. And so, of course, the elevator's there, and the president walks in, and he leans up against the back thing, and as the other people are piling on, and he got his pipe in his mouth. This little girl, she couldn't have been 5 feet tall. She says, "No smoking, no smoking." The president looks, and he just knocks all the ashes off in the pocket. I can't understand why it didn't catch fire, but just just the spontaneous sort of reaction, and we could regale you with hours and hours of all these little kind of things like that, the little human moments you see here and there, and again they go to enriching how the advance operation at the end of the day really tries to capture who the president is, what the president wants to achieve, and your execution is about how, if he were doing this, how would he react, and how would he treat these people, and what would he want to have done, and things of that nature.
Did you work on the Helsinki trip?
I did.
What was that like?
Well, that Frank Gerson Marceau was the one that had the big headache there. He was the in charge of the site guy. Well, of course, I don't think, other than if you went to the UN, which was a sort of a normal thing and everybody was there, that there was anything like Helsinki. The thing I remember most about was out in front of the big hall. There were like 96 motorcades that had to be coordinated, dropping off the heads of the state and all this kind of stuff. Oh, unbelievable, about comings and goings and protocol, who goes first and who goes second, and doing all that. It's one of the ultimate Keystone Cop kind of things. You're just sitting there watching this all happen, and they executed it. It worked out fine. But it was also with so many different governments, and the Finns did a great job. I mean, no question, it was a phenomenal thing. But all these people, many of them didn't have relations or didn't do anything. And so the Finns didn't know exactly what everybody else was going to do here and there, and then some of them they did. Of course, the really big countries and the ones that were neighbors and all, they paid a lot of attention to. But so there was a lot of it that was sort of spontaneous and things that would happen that you didn't exactly know as planned, and also you had to stay fast and loose. But it all turned out. At the time, the president got a lot of criticism for participating in that. But I think what it's ultimately become is I've heard absolutely unsolicited, and nobody knew I had anything to do with it. They harken back to how the Helsinki thing really set a lot of what we now called, for lack of better, sustainability, care for people, elevating concern for people and the environment and freedom and all those kind of things are often harken back to that period of time. So you didn't quite get the sense of that when you were there, but I was paying more attention to the logistics and the moves and what was supposed to happen than it was the substance. So I can't really take much to comment on about what was read there and the exact nature of the document, but I knew what the intent was.
The Vladivostok summit, which was a little bit different.
I came right after Tokyo.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
This is another one of the Soviet American summits. By this time, it's got to be, if 74 is routine, then by this point, you guys have got to be old hat.
And as a matter of fact, Vladivostok at that time was where all their super secret stuff was and everything.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
yeah, So
it's like having an American summit at Cheyenne Mountain.
Yeah. See, we had a negotiating session about. Well, we'll just go over there. What? Well, we always travel like this. And then finally, Mr. Cavaney, would you please come outside? And I was over there with, I think Bob Gates at that time was the national, the CIA national security guy on the trip, and he told me what was there. But we were trying to smoke them out, and they finally had to tell us why they couldn't take everybody over there. So we pared way down and sent in a very small group that pooled the media, which was a big deal to them, and a bunch of us, didn't go either. But yeah, it was kind of interesting. So to this day, I was not in those kinds, so I don't know what exactly happened. But it was, as you say, there'd been ongoing discussions and interactions, and you knew many of the players and all that kind of stuff. So it didn't seem to me it mattered so very much whether they did it here or there or wherever. But yeah, Vladivostok was the spot.
Now, the 76 campaign for President Ford was a year-long endeavor.
Yeah.
Because he's the maybe somebody in 20 years will correct me on this, but I think that he's really the only modern president to face a nomination battle as well as a general election battle as sitting president.
Jimmy Carter ended up ultimately doing that.
Right, with Teddy.
So Ford may well have been the first to
but
have that.
Ford was in 76, you go into the convention and people don't know who's going to win. He doesn't have a majority locked up yet. He's still persuading.
That's right.
So David Kennelly has a picture of the president standing in front of the Hawaiian delegation in LA.
Yeah. We did a deal there. We tried to figure out how we would differentiate ourselves at the convention, because it was still, as you say, in doubt. And one of the things we did is up in the presidential suite area, we replicated the Oval Office. We recreated it so it looked it wasn't perfect because they had orange shag carpet, but other than the orange shag carpet, but he had sort of a white and a yellowish one. But besides the big typical carpet that a president always had, the shag carpet, but everything we had a desk that was very similar in the look. We had the seal, we had the flags, we had the books, and we had the jumbo photos all around, and a couple of the bronze statues that we got. We put it in there, and what we use that is he would call up individual delegates. They would be ushered up to this, and they open the door. It would be like this, and they'd say, "Oh, please wait here. The president will be right here." And they take photos of it and all that. And so that was one of our ways to try and establish this persona of service and leadership, and he is the president and all that, because inside that hall every man's the same, so to speak. So it wasn't. And then it was a test vote. It was not the actual vote never really occurred. It was
right.
It was a test vote that actually swung the election. But yeah, we were there for a month on the ground, beforehand, and including the week of the convention and all, to do our part. And we didn't have responsibility for the planning of the convention, which is a job I later was involved in. Ours was to take care of the forward effort there, and the people who ran it for the RNC had to balance off the Reagan preferences or our preferences and try and do the best they could of making everything work together. But
and the primaries must have also been a little bit, because those must have been strenuous. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that year, I needed a new pair of shoes every 6 weeks. Just from walking, walking the pavement, going to the tarmac, doing all. It was that, and there was a lot of, at the end of that year before I just basically took all my clothes that I'd worn and just basically gave them away. I'm sure they weren't worth anything to anybody, but I just, they'd been worn and all, and you just felt a real sense of sort of, I guess like a world-class athlete does when they've been performing at something like that. When it's over, it's over. And that was sort of, the sense of, well, we did it, we survived. Weren't too many things there that went wrong. Had a lot of fun. I mean, there are a lot of high moments in those things and all, but doing those and keeping that cycle and that pace up is really, really tough, because you can never let up. You just don't know. As it turned out to be the case there, had one of those primaries gone one way or the other, you wouldn't have had a contested convention. So every vote counted.
Now, the general election, Dick Cheney is now chief of staff, also very involved, obviously, in the campaign.
Yep.
How do you work with him? You said you were tour director. First, tell us a little bit, what is the term tour director? Because this is almost a Nixon-Ford term.
Yeah. I've seen people use it subsequently. You're the tour director is usually given to the person who runs the advanced operation, because all the people that are executing the trips report to you. But tour director gets elevated because there are political calls that are being made at the time. You're responsible for all of those. You're the one person, again, as I mentioned earlier, that somebody can go to and say, well, what the hell's going on here? Who's going to be there? You have the answers and can usually settle things down. And so you, you did also, as head of the events office, traveled on the plane. You were with the president all of the time. So you could make any last minute adjustments that needed to be done. And so I would usually sit at that table up forward with Dick was there, David Kennerly, myself, Terry O'Donnell, usually the four of us, and then Ron Nissen, the press secretary, he was there. Would do that, and then if there was a policy person or somebody or a national security person, they would be there. But that little core basically had in it the elements of, if somebody needed to know something about what was happening next or what was going to happen in 2 days or something like that. And in campaigns, you're always instantly working several days ahead. So a tour director has the responsibility of knowing all of that kind of stuff. Then during a campaign, you have a political person that travels with you who can give you the political responses. But we knew which political people were interacting, not all the stuff that went on, in the political world.
How difficult was it in that fall? I mean, as Governor Carter at that point is.
I think the thing that was most frustrating was we got the polls from Teeter on the Friday night before the election, and for the first time we'd been down 33 points when we came out of the convention. Nobody had ever come back from that. And on that Friday night, we went over. We were ahead. And had a good weekend, and I don't know something happened, because there was enough sufficient flips that we ended up losing. But I am sure everybody else thought the same thing. Oh my God, we could actually maybe even win this. You didn't allow yourself the luxury of thinking that. But what you do say is, oh, had we done 2 more stops or something, could we have done that? But the president he had the grand bargain that he had to work out with Cheney, which was, did anybody ever tell you about one of the things that they discovered fairly early on when Teeter started to poll was that the president had more people respected him and things like that when he was acting in his role as president than when he was out campaigning. But of course the president loved to campaign. And so in the early stages, he wanted to be on the road all the time. He didn't want to be in the White House. Well, the political people and the pollsters and Cheney, they wanted him being president because that's what worked best. So they had these big negotiations. They finally worked out a deal where sort of we in the advance operation called it the lights out. And they negotiated a thing where the president could go outside the White House for some trips X number of times each week, but that he really had to stay in there and be president, and that was what worked for him. And he said, okay, he said, but, I can't remember whether it was 10 days, 11 days, 2 weeks, but such and such a day, we're going to turn off the lights and leave the White House, and we're going to stay out there until the election. And that was the grand bargain. So the last 2 weeks were absolute nonstop. And Jerry Ford was one of those people who had an instinct. He didn't like a hole in the schedule, where Nixon was the exact opposite. He wanted us a couple hours here, a couple hours there. Jerry Ford said, well, hey, we got another hour. Can't we bring some people up here that want to talk or do this? I mean, that was, God love him, that was the way he was like that. So you'd start early in the morning and you would go to late at night and you'd get up and you'd repeat this every other day. And then we came across this deal that we thought he really liked. And since we were campaigning block to block, we called it the talking car. So he loved the fact that you could slide the top back on the limo and that there was a hook in. He could have a handheld mic and there's speakers in the grill. And so he could talk to crowds and everything from the car. We could go through little towns and he could stop and do it. And plus he did all the big events. So by about 4 or 5 days out from election day, he can't talk. He can't say anything. And so everybody's giving him all this whole, and we're getting people, here's a recipe that my aunt so-and-so did. Or, I mean, it was just, everybody wanted him to do well. And then we finally get to Grand Rapids, for the big homecoming thing. And I mean, I am surprised he got any words out that time, but it was such an unbelievable outpouring. It was late at night, and he arrived at everybody in the town and from Lord knows from wherever was out on the street, and it was just really an emotional homecoming and all of that. And as I said, by then he just couldn't talk, and that was the period of time in which he sort of inched ahead kind of thing. And so that was probably the high water mark of what he had done, and he brought back this tremendous 33 points. Somebody who had a tough battle getting through the primaries, and what a different world we might have had he won that election. Would Ronald Reagan ever have become president? Did you need a Jimmy Carter and the problems that were created on his watch to bring in somebody like a Ronald Reagan? That's all those, I think, really could well have changed the course of the world. And you think back, if Richard Nixon had chosen somebody other than Jerry Ford, where might we be? So, Nixon, I think I've never heard it said this way, but I think probably one of Nixon's greatest gifts was he chose Jerry Ford. Because who would have thought, having gone through that terrible period from early 73 to 76, that we would be as good off for the next presidential election as we were that one, certainly, and yet we'd been through all of what had transpired in there. And I think the credit was that Nixon chose somebody who was at heart such a decent person that he just fit the needs for the times. So there'll be, I think, I would put that right up there. There's many of the great triumphs of Russia, the great triumphs of getting to the Middle East, the great triumphs of China, what he did with a lot of the programs establishing the Environmental Protection Agency and all that. I think choosing Jerry Ford as his vice president, and then where that led to. Probably another one of those has got to be in among that very small handful of really game changer kinds of legacies that Richard Nixon left for the American people.
Are there any other anecdotes or reflections that you want to put on the record?
We don't have enough time, and I'm sure that you've heard more than enough anecdotes coming from the advance person. They're the kind of folks that could regale you for an entire evening and then never repeat the same story twice. But it was an honor. It was a very, very high honor to have served President Nixon, and I think he ushered in a dramatic change in the direction of where the country was going to go, reordered a lot of the priorities, and helped, I think, build enough of a base that when Jimmy Carter followed and really did run into some very serious troubles, Ronald Reagan was able to come in, having been through that experience with Ford, but having drawn on a lot of the core conservative principles that were started by Richard Nixon, and then take that and move us to levels where probably for an entire generation we were a country on the right side of moderate rather than on the left side of moderate in terms of where the middle of the heart of the country was. And again, a legacy to Richard Nixon and his friendship with Barry Goldwater. I mentioned earlier that last trip we did, which was out to Phoenix, and we spent time up at the Goldwater Ranch to give him a chance to say a few things. The old war horses, if you will, who really were, I think, along with several others, but in terms of elected officials, the core of what became the modern conservative movement.
Mr. Cavaney, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I hope I was able to contribute something of value to this, or if say one never knows. Oh, good. So